this video, we seek to do three things. First, we aim to talk about the transition that Marxism went through, when there was the influence of different wars, and there were different attempts to develop a strategy to change the international system, and there were obstacles created by capitalism. All of this has already been addressed in the video of Marxism in International Relations. After that, we'll talk about the two types of knowledge that critical theory offers. This theory seeks to show that the transformations of Marxism teaches us that there is a more profound transformation than a transformation of the economic system. Marx, for example, has this expectation that knowledge is a tool fundamentally aimed at producing progress that will lead to some relevant transformation for humanity. So, modernity is marked by this expectation that knowledge is capable of transforming the circumstances that reality imposes on it. It is no longer necessary to conform to the circumstances of reality. The modern world has developed a kind of knowledge so powerful that it allows you to transform the circumstances of the reality in which you live. Knowledge is a useful tool to understand what reality is and to transform a better reality than what we have today. In the context of the second half of the 20th century, some authors seek to rethink modernity. We have a scenario where there was, for example, the atomic bomb and the Holocaust. Therefore, the authors will begin to think about these achievements of modernity with greater skepticism. They begin to defend the idea that many of the achievements of modernity were used to create tools against humanity itself. Thus, the mission of critical theory after this transformation that humanity undergoes in the 20th century is to understand why humanity has gone from using reason as an instrument to produce human emancipation to reason being an instrument that limits the possibilities of emancipation of man. Furthermore, it is necessary to think about how to correct the trajectory of this knowledge. Therefore, we must understand why we acted in such a way, and how to redirect our actions, how to recover the capacity of knowledge, not only to look at the world as it is, but also to understand how to change it. Thus, we have two fundamental categories to understand the problem of knowledge. We have a traditional theory, or what Cox calls problem-solving theory, which are those positivist theories which look at the world as representation. These theories reinforce a specific, generally conservative view of reality. Thus, it is understood that the whole theory that tells us about how reality really is, deep down it seeks to make you conform to that version of reality, and to prevent or hinder the process through which it is possible to seek a new version to that same reality. Another alternative way of dealing with the problem of knowledge is critical theory. Critical theory is an instrument that doesn't see itself as universal and doesn't attempt to define reality. It is an instrument that looks at the world as something dynamic, and therefore seeks to show that the forces that act in it cannot be understood as neutral forces. This happens because if we are in a reality undergoing a process of change, you either act to preserve the status quo that marks the reality prior to the possibility of change, or you will work towards advancing a possibility that did not exist before. A dynamic world in a context of change does not allow for the idea of neutrality. Therefore, critical theory enables you to try to recognize the windows of opportunity for emancipation. We have the idea of rescuing the fundamental principle of Marxist thought, in which the role of knowledge itself is not to explain reality, but to transform it. Thus, we also have an attempt to illustrate this reflection with an analysis of the international system in the context of the Cold War, seeking to observe the reality in flux. We have an understanding of the transition process between the 19th century British hegemony and the 20th century American hegemony, which allows us to understand the processes through which we can diagnose the fragility of this hegemony and to think about the problem of change within this system. So, in the first part of this video, we'll look at how Marxism materialized this practice in the 20th century, and how the way that Marxism combined theory and reality ended up being deflated by capitalism. In the 19th century, the fundamental transformations of capitalism are related to this fusion between the industrial bourgeoisie, the bourgeoisie of countries that came out ahead of the Industrial Revolution, and the growth of banking capital. In this, capitalism becomes transnational. This transformation marks 19th century capitalism and the strategies to overcome capitalism. Thus, there's a need for the international labor movement. As we have seen in the video about Marxism in international relations, it led to the international movement that failed at the beginning of the First World War. This movement was organized and the systemic crisis they were waiting for took place. But instead of investing in the international effort to accelerate the crisis of capitalism to achieve systemic change, the workers chose to join the war efforts of their particular countries. In this, we have a new situation marked by nationalism as a determining force. Lenin looks at the consequences of the exacerbation of that nationalist effort, which is the scale of hostility generated by the imperialist race and tension produced between the imperialist efforts of countries like France and England and the national liberation movements of the peripheral countries. We have a new vision about the system, and in light of that, we have a new strategy to overcome this system. The Second World War creates a particular scenario because the Americans come out of the war as a far superior force. Americans created a model of capitalism capable of distributing wealth in a way that has not been done before. The context of war mobilization itself led to a social consensus that there must be an effort to restructure these societies through mechanisms of wealth distribution. This new metamorphosis of capitalism made it impossible for the revolutionary discourse to continue to be developed within this scenario. Faced with the growth of capitalist forces and the redistribution of wealth, it was difficult to mobilize workers around a new revolutionary strategy. At the end of the Second World War, Marxism entered a certain impasse. On the one hand, we have the socialist countries, where the exposure of the brutality of the USSR in the Western academic milieu makes the political defense of this project difficult. Once some people manage to take refuge from the Soviet Union and report on the kind of repression that Stalin implemented, it becomes difficult for Marxists in Europe to defend politically what the Soviet Union stands for. On the other hand, Marxism without a working class strategy in Western countries becomes, in the academic world, a positivist theory. An important transformation that Marxism undergoes is that it fails to bring a thought marked by this dialectic between the conceptual structures that allow you to understand reality and the reaction strategies through which you seek to transform reality. It becomes a theory like Waltz, a theory that seeks to recognize what kinds of patterns of functioning of this reality have given capitalism such great resilience that it has enabled this system to adapt to the different attempts at rupture that have been undertaken in the last years. It stops being a reflection on how you can break with capitalism and becomes a reflection on how capitalism was able to resist all the attempts to break it. We also have the Frankfurt School. It is a theory that seeks to transform Marxist reflection insofar as it shifts the focus away from the reflection of Marxism on the economic system itself. Marxism fails to look at the crisis that the 20th century represents. In particular, the crisis that the Second World War represents within the Western political imagination. And they start looking at that moment that redefines the problem of capitalism and the problem of modernity. One of the reasons why Marxist reflection was so incapable of understanding these transformations is because it is embedded within this context of modernity. Marx was a modern thinker and also a product of his society, in which there is a specific perspective of modernity. In this, the knowledge generated by the transformations brought about by the Industrial Revolution, combined with the Scientific Revolution, creates a universe of possibilities that allows the redefinition of the problem of knowledge. Knowledge is no longer an instrument for dealing with the world, for surviving reality. For Marx, the instrument is a tool to change society. There is a very optimistic perception of man's ability to use reason to overcome the problems that the world has imposed on humanity in previous centuries. European civilization is living at a time when man's knowledge of the world is more sophisticated and man has the ability to transform this knowledge into useful technology and to increase his productivity, quality of life, and possibilities of prosperity. All of this multiplies on an unprecedented scale. The productivity generated by the Industrial Revolution, which made capitalism possible, is so unprecedented that it breaks the Malthusian pattern that there would come a time when there would be more people than the amount of production available. Thus, the Frankfurt School seeks to reread Marxism. They question why Marxism was unable to understand its own difficulty in overcoming the limits of that capitalist system. Marxism is a product of the same modern world, and it is necessary to understand how this modernity structures the reality that comes after it. This is to understand the limits of capitalism and the limits that Marxism has for thinking about capitalism. If we stop thinking about Marxism only from the point of view of the economic problem and the mechanisms of economic regulation, and understand the moment that Marx is living as a moment marked by optimism regarding the possibilities of modernity, we realize that both Marx and liberals have something in common. They look at the modern world and the development of technology and the power we have appropriated to develop knowledge about the world and to turn that knowledge into technology, and turn that technology into control over the environment, as something that generates a world beyond the problem of scarcity, which was the view of the world that we had previously. The modern world allows you an understanding of the problem of reason, where all the problems faced can eventually be overcome by the development of science. Thus, it is understood that there is no limit to the ability to use technology to change people's lives for the better. Both liberalism and Marxism are looking at the world through the same prism, that there is an optimism about the potential that the transformations that the modern world has brought about in the capacity of knowledge, science, and reason to transform the world to the best. World War II ends this optimism about man's use of the knowledge he possesses. The end of the Second World War is a symbol of how the height of technological development did not mark a break in man's ability to go beyond his frontiers of possibility and increase his productivity and divide it to produce more emancipation. World War II showed that the divisions within humanity are so deep that we use technologies to produce something of such a destructive character that the destructiveness of this technology surpasses humanity's own material possibilities. The atomic bomb symbolizes this. The atomic bomb symbolizes the moment when the destructive capacity of technology is superior to the constructive capacity of technology. It is a tool capable of destroying humanity as a whole, on a scale where once it is triggered, we are unable to control the consequences of this technology. At the same time, the Holocaust is also a symbol of pessimism about the possibilities of reason. This is because the Holocaust marks the scientificization of dehumanization. The Holocaust is a silent and systematic process of destruction. Thus, we have a moment of great pessimism in the international system regarding its future after the Second World War. From the point of view of this philosophical reflection, it is necessary to think beyond economic rivalries. It is necessary to think about the exacerbated optimism that we had in relation to the possibilities brought by our rational condition and by the project of civilization in which we bet. This goes beyond the economic system. If we want to rescue the emancipatory possibility of knowledge, we cover the Marxist principle from the point of view of Marx's use of knowledge, in which knowledge is an instrument that allows the recognition of nature, but it is a recognition that only makes sense in view of its capacity to act on this reality with the objective of transforming it for the better. Here we have the idea that the role of knowledge, both from a practical and ethical point of view, is to produce knowledge that aims to transform the world towards a better world than the one we live in today. In order to recover this process, the first thing to understand is why reason was led in this direction, why it changed from an instrument of emancipation to an instrument of domination and dehumanization, which is what the moment after World War II symbolizes. From the diagnosis of the depth of this reality, it will be possible to produce strategies to recover the critical emancipatory potential of knowledge. For this, it is necessary to divide the knowledge instruments into two types. We have traditional theory, or what Cox calls problem-solving theory, and we have critical theory. There is no middle ground, and the two theories are not confused. They are dichotomies. Traditional theory sees knowledge as an instrument for representing reality as it is, where knowledge is like a map. The purpose of a map is to represent reality. The map is not the same as the world it represents. But there are maps more proportionately suited to reality than others. Scale is what matters, how well your map represents reality or not, so you need to worry about the quality of the map. Thus, the objective is to understand the patterns and be able to operate in reality in order to understand reality and solve problems. Through the logic of representation, we understand that it is not just describing reality, but understanding the gears through which reality works, the patterns that govern that reality, and noticing when a gear is out of place and how to reconstruct this picture. This is the traditional theory, also called problem solving. For the Frankfurt School, they understand that, in traditional theory, reality is static. We can only map a reality if it doesn't change. If it changed, we would have to change the representation. Therefore, if we look at the world from the perspective of representation, we assume that the figure we are trying to reproduce is static. This knowledge model of controlling nature to optimize the transformation of industry to improve human life, it needs this idea of looking at reality as something static. It needs to consolidate three fundamental assumptions about knowledge. First, reality is unique. It is independent of who produces knowledge about it. Second, knowledge is neutral, ahistorical. It follows patterns. The mechanisms that make up reality will not fall apart. And third, knowledge is universal. The objective is to produce knowledge that can be applied to different realms of reality. The more generalizable, the more useful. The starting point for this reflection is to look at the instrument that marked this fusion between theory and practice in the modern world. But this static character doesn't exist, and the authors question what happens when you create a static model to deal with a dynamic reality. What happens is that the model does not work as a representation of reality, but rather as a model for preserving the framework of reality on which it is based before it enters the process of change. Waltz builds an analytical model to defend the thesis on bipolarity. Concepts are universalized. It deals with units of analysis. The conflict between Athens and Sparta is within the logic of bipolarity. They are units. So we have the idea that we have units and also have the distribution of capabilities in these units. The result of the dynamics of the distribution of capabilities generates two configurations of power, bipolarity or multipolarity. Bipolarity is seen as much more stable than multipolarity, but the scenario of the Cold War starts to show some changes. What this historical moment presents are decisive changes in this system. It is a moment of turmoil in the international system, but as Waltz is within this scenario, he only looks for circumstances for the continued functioning of the system. In the Frankfurt School's view, Waltz is not diagnosing bipolarity. He is advocating stability and bipolarity. He seeks to ignore forces towards change and to reinforce the power structure that is entrenched in the system. This is important because it is the key to critical theory thinking. There is no such thing as neutrality. All knowledge that advocates neutrality is not neutral. It is a defense of the current correlation of forces. Every conceptual instrument that starts from the principle of neutrality actually plays a conservative role in the balance of forces. This is because by becoming effective, when Waltz convinces us that bipolarity is the best, he actually seeks to defend a correlation of forces whose possibilities for change are beginning to be announced in front of him. Waltz does not describe reality as it is. He defends the status quo. The knowledge he produces is not an instrument for diagnosing reality, but for intervening in reality. It is a reality-conserving intervention, with the objective of making it possible to ignore changes and rely on structures that are already consolidated within the system. Waltz thinks about how to produce a theory to explain any system. He wants to produce such a broad and scientific theory that allows him to develop hypotheses to explain the behavior of older times as well as the Cold War. There is an emphasis on what is verifiable. It is necessary to produce a comparison between the behavior of older times and Soviet behavior, for example. But in critical theory, its role is to intervene in reality in order to transform it into something better than what we have today. Therefore, it must recognize the role of existing structures as structures of domination. They are reality-conserving intervention instruments, and it must build a piece of knowledge that interprets reality as something dynamic. When we talk about patterns of functioning, we are talking about a systematic repetition of events that we assume will be repeated in the future, and therefore cannot be different from what they were before. Structuralist theories were conservative theories, including neo-Marxism. Since we recognize that every theory that talks about a structure is seeking to curtail the dynamics of reality in order to stiffen the structure and allow the survival of a certain relationship or forces, the objective of its knowledge is to understand changes. In this way, they seek to understand the dynamics of reality. When we talk about reality as dynamic, a natural consequence of this process of understanding is that the actors who act and produce knowledge about this reality, they cannot be neutral. We can only be neutral in relation to a static reality. In relation to a dynamic reality, we can only work to reinforce the patterns that already exist within the system, or recognize the forces that can reshape the system's reality. There is no middle ground. Either we do traditional theory or critical theory. Therefore, according to Cox, reality is always made for someone with some purpose. Authors always have an agenda, so knowledge must be geared towards recognizing the forces within that reality to move it in a direction where there is a better perspective. There is always an agenda about the reality that the author studies. Thus, if reality is dynamic and we have a perspective on reality, its role is to recognize in the dynamics of reality the windows of opportunity for change for the better. Recognizing the dynamics that reality imposes on you, we must understand the spaces in which emancipation is possible. So, for this theoretical perspective, the idea of emancipation is fundamental. Critical theory has three elements. The historical instrument. It is an instrument that demands perspective. The author is not neutral, he wants to do something with reality, be it to keep it or change it. And the goal is to change for the better, emancipation. The difference between traditional theory and critical theory is that traditional theory seeks to recognize something that is universal, that does not change over time. Critical theory seeks emancipation. For Cox, he seeks to build a model to explain how these things work. He seeks to show how walls work, symbolizes and reflects all the elements he explained about the problem of traditional theory. It is a theory that advocates a universal aspect, neutrality and ahistoricity. Cox seeks to show how to understand the contradictions of the American hegemony project by understanding the historical process of transition from British hegemony to American hegemony. The analysis model he built is based on the dynamic of historical transition. He doesn't look for continuity, he looks for change. Wald seeks to build this system of representation, a map of international politics, looking at the concept of distribution of capabilities as if it were the conceptual key to translating the globe in its complexity into the map. Rather than looking at this representational process, Cox understands that political action is involved in a combination of material capacities, institutions, and ideas. As we have a triad with different possibilities of combination, we can understand the interaction dynamics between these three things and the political consequences of this interaction. Cox talks about the process of hegemony and British order. From the point of view of material capabilities, the British order is based on naval power. Without naval preponderance during the 19th century, commercial freedom and colonial expansion would not take place. Naval hegemony is key to the process in which they transform themselves from an isolated country into something that is an industrial engine of financial globalization. From an institutional point of view, guided by a liberal perception, we have few institutions. The institution organizes the interaction between countries is the gold coin. It is useful because it allows the British to use the strong currency they have, which is a product of the privileged situation of pioneering the Industrial Revolution, and allows them to expand that expansion platform across the world. So we have naval power. It opens trade between countries, frees slaves, it gives stability to the roots. We have the gold coin, which powers the British currency and boosts its exports around the world. And we have the influence of liberalism. Through the relationship between material capacities, institutions, and ideas, we can effectively understand the dynamic of the British order. But looking back, it is also through the analysis of the ownership of these three things that we realize how fragile this order was. Due to the lack of robust institutions capable of holding the less favored countries in contexts of crisis, this order only functioned while the Americans and the German naval power were not able to compete with the British naval power. This has changed since the 20th century. British hegemony was made possible by fragile circumstances. Once the United Kingdom lost the capacity to fulfill this role, this order quickly collapsed. Given the fact that it did not have institutions capable of providing capillarity to the system's operating norms and capable of accommodating the dynamics of weaker countries and committing them to the functioning of the order, everything collapsed quickly. American hegemony seeks to do differently. They built the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and other institutions. They tried to build an order with capillarity to provide stability to the system's non-hegemonic forces. Liberalism is redefined to allow countries to control capital, something that did not exist at the time of the gold coin standard. With that, the economies would rebuild so as not to enter weakened into the free trade agreements that are beginning to be structured. It was a different power in its ways of structuring its economic and military power. The US did not depend on naval power like the UK. Post-Second World War, international stability depended more on land power than naval power. So we have a readjustment in these three elements. This allows us to understand how the weaknesses of a given scenario were the condition for the possibility of reorganizing a system, and how, when looking at this very moment in which you live as a dynamic moment, product of a dynamic combination of these three variables, we can observe that we also have weaknesses that we can intervene to change the system. In the 70s, as a result of the decolonization process, these institutional structures built in the post-Second World War by the Americans have more Third World countries with voting power than First World countries. Third World countries begin to control the agenda of the General Assembly, the UN Commission for Development, etc. The very structures that American hegemony erects to give stability to its power can be used to question some elements of American hegemony. In this space of a Third World movement, in which it operates within institutions built by the hegemonic force, but which uses these institutions to promote an anti-hegemonic agenda, this pressure for rupture can occur. In this, the window of opportunity for an agenda of resistance to the perimeters of American hegemony can be operated. Critical theory becomes influential in international relations in Koch's paper. To understand this theory, it is important to know that they are concerned with the relationship between theory and practice inherited from Marxism. It is about a political commitment to using knowledge to develop a strategy for social transformation. Furthermore, it has the view that the problem of knowledge has the ethical and political objective of seeking transformation. The role of knowledge itself is not to describe reality, but to intervene in it. This role has always been present in the transformations that Marxism underwent at the end of the 19th century, passing through the First World War and the Second World War. With the Second World War, it generates a context of fragmentation of Marxism, because of the scenario that combined brutal Stalinism and a privileged resource distribution productivity in the American scenario. In addition, there is a new way of thinking that Marxists develop that stems from the difficulty of mobilizing the proletariat actor around a strategy of rupture. In a context of productivity, it is easier to convince the proletarian that he can become the middle class than to convince him to put everything he has at risk in a revolutionary strategy that may not work. One of the important counterpoints is the creation of the Frankfurt School, formed by Marxists who are looking at the problems that cross the 20th century, less from the point of view of the specificities of economic mechanisms. They observe the transformations that permeate modernity. Mainly this optimism that takes over the world in the post-19th century of the overlapping of industrial and scientific revolutions that European society goes through. It creates a kind of belief and hope in the capacity of knowledge, through its control of nature, to extract from it a productivity previously impossible to extract and to increase people's quality of life. This would lead to the point where you are heading in a direction where conflicts in society would be lessened by technology's ability to create more and distribute it among others. This fundamentally underestimates the human ability to use reason for evil things. This marks the impasse after the Second World War of admitting that the promise between technology and prosperity has not been fulfilled, but has generated a degree of destruction superior to any technological instrument that we have developed to improve society's quality of life. Faced with this scenario, the ideal way to rescue Marxist thinking and the ethical principle of emancipation is to understand how modernity entered this process in which the instruments that generated prosperity are transformed into instruments that allows the domination of man and the instrumentalization of knowledge and technology to increase the vulnerability and dehumanization of societies. Thus, it is necessary to understand the role that knowledge can play and what is the criticism that can be made of these transformations. Thus, it arrives in two categories. It is necessary to understand the dichotomy. We have the traditional theory, neutrality, universality, and ahistorical character that tries to look at the world through representation. Because of this, it comes to recognize reality as static, and because of that, it takes on an active role in preserving the status quo. It is not a neutral theory, but rather a theory that preserves what it recognizes. In contrast, we have critical theory. To produce a critical theory, it is necessary to recognize the dynamic character of reality, look for change, understand the perspective in the construction of knowledge, since all knowledge is made by someone with some purpose. Finally, we must look at the opportunities for emancipation to change and achieve a better world than it exists today. Marx tries to illustrate this by showing how this applies to the analysis of the conjuncture of what he lives. Instead of looking at the international system, focus exclusively on the notion of material capabilities, which would generate a deterministic perception of the international system, we understand the dynamics through the interaction around three factors. Thus, we look at the historical transition between these three factors to understand the contradictions that mark the contemporary world. We realize that the British order is marked by a particular relationship between material capacities, ideas, and institutions. While British economic capacity was undisputed, the flexibility they enjoyed within the gold standard was a key strategic resource for their global projection and for ideological projection within liberalism. From the moment these conditions were no longer present, as a result of the conjuncture of the war, American hegemony had to rebuild an order by learning from the failure of the United Kingdom. In a scenario of instability, it was necessary to build institutions that give capacity to its hegemony. It is necessary to meet the demands of weaker countries, and it takes structures capable of accommodating and providing stability to the weaker forces to rebuild the economic processes before they are able to compete in liberal, borderless global markets, the aspiration of the way liberalism sees the world. This tactical shift in American hegemony created new possibilities, but it also allowed us to learn which vulnerabilities are likely to be exploited. If the British appropriated the flexibility of the gold standard and the Americans opted for institutional rigidities, it is possible to exploit that rigidity to use the institutions the Americans built against their political agenda. That's all. If you liked this video, then don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Also, next video is about constructivism. If you don't want to miss it, then hit the notification bell. Until next time, thanks for watching.